Thanks. It's always when I want to start videos. Hey guys, my name is Victoria, welcome back to my channel. It's been a while. I don't want to make this intro too long. Today we're going to talk about poetry. I wanted to talk more about poetry for a while now, and I'm really excited to finally have a video that I think can start sort of this new series on my channel maybe, which is how to read poetry. I have made videos about poetry before, and I have offered sort of my ways of reading poetry and my ways of trying to work with this art or just enjoy it. But I wanted a video where all of this would be in one place, so you could watch it, make a list, and maybe if you think some of these tips are useful, you can maybe apply them to your reading of poetry as well. Of course, I want to disclaim this first. This is just my list. It is not universal. It is not a rule. Enjoy whatever you want to enjoy it however you want to enjoy it. Just things that I think might have helped me in the beginning of understanding poetry or just enjoying it, because I know a lot of people who would love to read more poetry but have no idea where to start. So yeah, without further ado, let's get into it. So the first thing I wrote down was, if you haven't been exposed to poetry since high school maybe, then maybe you need to change the way you think about poetry, especially because high school puts such a stigma, at least in my experience and from what I've heard of my peers, on poetry, that it's not really understandable and people are quite confused, because I've learned in high school that poetry is basically just something to be analyzed, and for a poem to have one interpretation, yeah, that was complete rubbish. And I've talked more about this in one of my videos. I think it's called The Art of Poetry. I'm gonna link it down below or on the eye, so you can maybe look into that if you're interested. But what I said is that, first of all, you have to look at poetry as it is. It is an art form. It is not something like a math problem that you have to solve. It is art. Where a painter uses their colors and their brushes, a poet uses their pen and their paper. So that's what you have to kind of think about and kind of broaden that term and broaden your way of thinking of poetry. The next thing, I think what made it easier for me was to think of poetry as songs. Back in the day, poetry was sung. That's how tales were told, and that's how people entertained themselves. So if you are a music lover, if you listen to music a lot, if you love lyrics especially, I believe that there's a good chance that you could fall in love with the written word without the melody. So that leads into my next point: find a poem. If you like to listen to music, if you have playlists that last 20 hours, why not go into those? Why not look for a song and for the first time not listen necessarily to the entire song, but look at the words, look at the lyrics. That's what I always loved doing. It is so much fun. And if you do not want to start with songs, there are other ways to look for poems. So you do not have any books, you do not have any resources yet. Where do you start? Pinterest is a very good way to start. Of course, the term poetry has been broadened in general in the last few years. The evolution of poetry is quite exciting and quite interesting to look at. I made a whole video about like this modern poetry, this Instagram poetry that is very popular currently. It's how I got into poetry. Even though my mind has changed over the years, and even though I do not enjoy that particular part or that particular genre of poetry, it is a good way to start. It is a good way to just get acquainted with words on the page, to think about what the poet might say or what this poem could be about. And since this modern type of poetry is very obvious and most of the time it is very clear on what the poet intended, I believe that that's a good start, and that's usually what comes up when you look up poetry on Pinterest or on Google. I bet you will find the name Rupi Kaur. I'm not a fan of her poetry, I made that very clear in that one video, but it is a good way to start, and that's how I started with it as well. Now, if you do not want to start with this modern type of poetry, if you actually want to get into poetry, I would recommend maybe purchasing something. It doesn't have to be expensive. There's a bunch of used books as well. Small, tiny collections, that's where I would start. I, for example, have this entire series of poems. It's a book for every season, so a poem for every winter day, a poem for every summer day, autumn and spring, and I would highly recommend them. In general, all the books which are edited by Allie Esiri, very recommendable. There's one on Shakespeare, I have it. There's one for every day, there's one for every night. So this is where I would start with. Maybe even look for the one that we have right now. It's spring currently, we're going into summer soon, so why not pick up one of these, read a poem every day. The great thing about these is that it has a poem for every day and every night. For example, this is a night poem for May 3rd by Edna St. Vincent Millay, which is one of my favorite poets of all time. And then you have the next one, which is the day poem for May 4th, and so on and so on. It's quite easy to understand. You are introduced to many names in this genre, and I believe there is something for you in this. Of course, if you do not want to purchase a book yet because you're not actually sure if you are a fan of poetry, I totally get that. And also, you know, money-wise, it's not the best thing to do. There are many websites on the internet that you can look into for poetry. I will link some down below. There's one I really love. Keep forgetting the name because I think it's so simple. It has a lot, like a ton of poems on this website, and I think there's a newsletter where you get a poem every single day. So that's also a great way to discover poems and poets from this century, from last century, and so on. So I think that's something I would definitely look into if you are interested in poetry. I'm also currently doing a poem for every day of the month of May. On my poetry account, I do not share my own poems and my story. I just take poems that I find on the internet or in the books that I have and share them. So if you want to discover, at the end of May, it's gonna be like 30 poems in there. Maybe check out my Instagram, self-advertisement, but you know, honestly, if you really want to get into poetry, it can be quite time consuming depending on how much time you devote to one poem. So let's get into that a little bit more. So after you find a poem, I would always advise to read it out loud. If you want to listen to it and you are quite unsure on how to read poetry yet because you're not familiar with it anymore, for example, we had to learn how to read poetry in school. I would recommend to check out websites. I would recommend after finding a poem to look it up. If you, for example, found it on Pinterest or in the book, look them up on Google. You will find websites where you can listen to the poem. Sometimes they're on YouTube, sometimes they're on the website that I'm going to link as well, because I believe it's so important to listen to poetry. Yes, rhyme and meter is getting less and less important, I would say. At least that's what I'm seeing right now in the world of poetry. But for some poems, especially if you read like poetry from the 19th century and even further back, I believe it's very important to listen to a poem because that's when you, I believe, know if you like a poem or not. So that's my next point. Listen to the words or read the words and find out what they elicit. Find out what they do to you emotional wise. That's what rhyme and meter are for. Obviously to maybe emphasize the meaning of the words, but it's also to sort of give clarity of the emotions that are supposed to be brought forward with a poem. I know this is quite complicated and I don't know if I'm able to explain it well, but what I mean is sometimes when you have this outside, like the skeleton of the poem, in which I always include like rhyme and meter and rhythm, it has a purpose, and that's what I also talked about in this one video where I said that if a poem, for example, has a very chaotic sort of rhythm, or it doesn't necessarily even have a rhythm, it doesn't have rhyme, it doesn't have meter necessarily, that is so interesting to look into. I will not go into detail, but if a poet does that, most of the time it has purpose. Most of the time it is there for you to look into and maybe elicit like chaotic emotions and maybe elicit turmoil. And the same thing is happening with the opposite. If a poem is very tidy, I always call it tidy. I know it's not a term I think you'd use, but when a poem has a very consistent meter, rhyme, rhythm, everything, maybe it's there for aesthetic reasons, but it's also maybe there to, you know, symbolize harmony. It is so interesting to look into that. So read the poem and just listen to the words and think about what they elicit to you. That is so interesting. So also, now I've made up another point, is there are many things to look into, but sometimes it's also just nice to listen to a poem and think, okay, what did that do to me? Honestly, it is totally fine if it takes like 100 poems for you to finally, you know, find one that does something to you emotion wise. I'm a high sensitive person. I feel things very deeply. I feel things very like intensely. Is that how you say it? For me, it is quite easy to see and to discover if I like a poem or not. I always compare it to going to a museum and looking at a painting, or looking just at art in general, at visual art, and thinking, I like this or I don't. Same thing with music. I listen to a song and I'm like, I like this or I don't. What I love about poetry is because it is art, you get to make it your own as well. You get to, not only in the interpretation process and analyzing process, but also just listening to something and feeling something through the words of someone else. Being able to connect with your emotions, being able to connect with yourself, with art is just something that I don't want to live without. It's something that helped me a lot. It is something that is a big part of my life. That's why I read poetry in the first place. I got a little bit carried away. I think you get what I'm saying. Actually, I already introduced my next point, which is decide if you like the poem or not. And sometimes it doesn't happen after reading it for the first time. Sometimes it takes several readings and several tries to find out, do I like this poem or not? Because it is not necessarily a visual art form. It is words on a page, and that is something that you have to find a connection with first if you never had that. So after deciding if you like the poem, if it's no, I wouldn't really waste my time on it. If the answer is yes, you like the poem, I think what you need to do is, if you want to spend time with it, obviously you can just enjoy it and say, hey, I really like this poem, I'm gonna save it and maybe read it again in 2 nights or in 2 weeks or in 2 years or in 20, doesn't really matter. But if you want to get more into it, read it again and write down your initial thoughts. I think this is like something that I would like to do more, which is really spend time with a poem, maybe like an hour, just thinking, what are my initial thoughts? What can I see? What are the passages I really love? I always highlight them. I don't necessarily have to understand a line to love it. They immediately paint a picture, and not necessarily semantically, so not necessarily connected to the meaning of the words, but also just the way they are connected, the way that the poet decided to put these words next to one another. That is something that happens to me quite a lot, and I just highlight these things and write down my initial thoughts. Comes into my next point. I look for the things that are written. I look for the things that the poet made clear with words and decided to put on the page, because the next point is something that is like my favorite part of art, is look for the things unwritten. Look for the things that are written between the lines. What did the poet decide not to write, but what is hidden? It's quite difficult to do this, to explain it, because sometimes it's also interesting to look into the things that a writer has not done. Every single question that comes into your head while reading poetry, while listening to it, everything that you think, oh, that was weird, everything is worth looking into if you want to spend time with a poem. Spending time with a poem basically means, for me, looking into it more, what the writer think, but mostly what do I get out of this? What do I see in the written word? What do I see in the unwritten word? What do I see in between the lines? It is so much fun. It is just an interesting way to connect with words, and you will find that the ability to understand a poem will get better and better. And sometimes you're stuck with a poem and you have no idea why this poet decided to write this. My next point is just being with your own interpretation of something is so much fun. It is connecting with the knowledge that you have. It is connecting with the emotions that you have. When spending some time with a poem, I usually just spend time with myself. It is so rewarding in the end. It is so precious, and I believe that with art you can also find parts of yourself that you have not encountered before. So that's why poetry and that's why art is so important to me, because not only did it comfort me in bad times, but it also just, how do I say this without sounding incredibly cringe? It just helped me see what person I am and what things I think of. Giving an example, because I think this is very confusing to people who are not inside my head right now. When reading a poem, or sometimes when writing a poem, I might have a specific picture in mind, an image or an emotion that I write down with metaphors and images and all kinds of stuff. And then I show it to my sister. And what I always love, and I said that multiple times on this channel as well, my favorite reaction is them either saying, honestly, I loved it. I thought it was so beautiful, but I did not understand it. I really love that, because that means that it's not important to always understand things, but it's also just important to enjoy things. That is something that poetry is, I think, also for. But the next reaction I always love is when they give me their own interpretation, when they tell me what word made them think of what metaphor they would interpret as such, And when it has nothing to do with my own image, with my own sort of thinking and picture that I painted in my head. Because that's the great thing about words. They can be so unique and they can mean something to everyone else. Everyone has different associations with a word, which I knew, but I've also now known that there is actually like evidence in that because I just had a week-long seminar on meaning and language, and it was so interesting to see that some people have such different associations with some words, and that's why I think you can see the individuality that poetry can elicit and draw out of someone, which I know this sounds so stupid when I say it, but it does make sense to me in my head. For example, some people might find dark colors very comforting. For example, me, I love dark colors. I feel very connected to them. I feel very comforted by dark colors, and some people are the exact opposite, and some people think, no, dark colors, they fence me and they make me feel like very moody and dark and melancholy, and I do not like that. I like pastel colors more, I like light colors more. So, you know, the individuality that a painting might elicit, you know, some people say, oh, this comforts me greatly, and then some people say, this gives me nightmares, you know, and I love that. That's the same thing that poetry does with words. Spending time with your own interpretation is basically just spending time with yourself. And what I want everyone to remember is your own interpretation is always valid, and especially when you're just doing it to spend time with yourself and just enjoy something. There's zero academic pressure behind it. And even if you have academic pressure, as long as you can, you know, argue for your point and argue for your interpretation, I don't think there's any room for anyone to say, oh no, you're wrong. If there is a person who says your interpretation, even though you explained your reasons behind your interpretation, it is still wrong, that person is in general wrong and has a wrong understanding of poetry. So do not listen to these people. Do not. Even if they're your teachers, they're wrong. And I'm not saying that because I have the authority to say it, but because I know it, because I talk to people, because I am a writer, because I talk to other writers, and I am a vast reader of this genre. So do not listen to these people. They're wrong. Sometimes there are poems that you have zero idea on, that you read and read and read, and you're like, what the hell does that even mean? And sometimes they're a bit frustrating. Sometimes you're like, damn, I would really like to understand this poem. That is where conversation is key, I think. Finding like-minded people and talking to them about a specific poem is so much fun. If you find yourself not having any of these people, I have a great tip, which is something that a lot of people nowadays use. ChatGPT. You can ask ChatGPT, give me an interpretation of this poem. And sometimes it is very vague. Sometimes it's very like, oh yeah, you're just saying whatever the poet said. And sometimes it's very interesting. Sometimes it brings new things in, and even though it is not as, in my opinion, as exciting as having a conversation with someone about a poem, it does sometimes give you a head start on how maybe this poem could be interpreted. I'm not saying explained, because I don't think a poem needs explanation, but you know, interpretation-wise, it is maybe a good way of understanding it if you are completely stuck and have no idea. Why not take advantage of new inventions and of new technology? Why not? After all of this, my last point is don't stress. I think I've made it very clear in this video that poetry is not in this world to give you any lessons, to give you any messages, to be solved like a math problem, as I said in the beginning. It is simply art. I think every single person who has an affinity for art gets to choose what art does for them. Some may find comfort, some may find just incredible nuance and incredible essence in something created by another person. Some people find a deeper connection to oneself or to another person through art. So basically just, in the end, enjoy it. There is no right or wrong. Having conversation about poetry is so much fun. Creating poetry is the greatest thing ever. There's also no black and white. A poem is just a creation that you get to discover. And if you decide you like that creation, if you like that discovery, why not discover more? And I think I could go on talking forever now, but I think this video is long enough. It was so much fun to just talk a little bit about poetry, to just, you know, get all of my thoughts into one video. If you think this is completely rubbish, totally fine. If you have your own sort of ways of enjoying this art form, please leave some comments down below. Let's have a conversation. Maybe share a poem that you wrote, maybe share a poem that you recently discovered and maybe not understand at all. Maybe we can all discuss in the comments what a poem might be about. Not what it might be about, what we think it might be about. So yeah, just enjoy it, just discover it. And yeah, I think this is it for this video. I really hope to be making more content in the future about poetry. I really hope you like it too. Let me know what you would like to see next. If you like this video, then please give it a thumbs up. Again, let's have conversation in the comments. If you want to know more about me, if you want to have more content, subscribe to this channel and maybe follow me on my Instagram. I have both of my accounts linked down below. Thank you so much for watching, guys. If you really watched till the end, I'm very, very thankful. Anyway, I'll be going now. I hope to see you in my next video. Bye! Can we talk about my jewelry? Yes, anyway. Bye!